This video is going to show the removal of an alternator on a 2001 MDX. As I'm working through the removal of the engine cover, I want to note that although this wasn't the most complicated job, it was extremely frustrating. The bolts and nuts for the alternator and the cabling are in a very awkward location, and it is very, very difficult to get to them. In addition, because of the age of the vehicle, the bolts were partially seized, and it took a significant amount of time to both release them and then to work them out. So with the engine cover off, the next thing you have to do is use a large breaker style bar with an open-ended wrench to move the tensioner pulley enough to get the belt off. It's pretty standard, but like I mentioned, everything's in a difficult spot and very tight in this vehicle. With the pulley off, we can go to work on the bolts for the alternator. There are two bolts on this alternator, and as I mentioned, they are very stubborn, and there is indeed a risk to snap these bolts off. I've read about many people that have done this. So even though I use an extension breaker bar, I'm very gentle and very delicate, and I just barely put enough force on it to make them move. And then I shift back and forth between the bolts to give myself both a rest and to um, permit the load to balance out between the bolts. So I put this portion in about 5x speed just to show how much time it took to work on these bolts to get them out. And for your sake, I cut some time for rests and some additional content that was duplicative. So here you see I finally got one of the two bolts. I would say by this point I've probably been working on these bolts for 15 to 20 minutes between the two of them. I just switched the camera angle to give a view, and then I just decided it was duplicative of over and over repeat trying to remove that bolt, and eventually it did come loose. Now I'm gonna remove the electrical connections to the alternator, which consist of one wiring harness and a heavy gauge cable that runs to the battery. It's important to note that at this point I've already disconnected the cables from the battery terminals. With the wire harness off, I go to work on the nut that is holding on the low gauge cable that runs to the battery. And of course, it's not in a good location and it's very difficult to get to. Again, running this in 5 times speed, you get a gist of just how long it takes to get this nut off. Eventually the nut comes free of the threads and the connector is loose. Now it's real tight in there, so to get that alternator out, we have to move the reservoir for the power steering pump. With that out of the way, we can grab the alternator and wiggle it and maneuver it through the opening and around any cabling and tubing that might be in the way. But if you work it right and you pull it through the right spot, eventually it will come out. For this car, we didn't have to remove the engine mount. With this video running a little long, I'm not going to show the installation process, but I will say it wasn't as stressful, and putting the bolts and nuts back in was much easier than taking them out. As you can see, the new alternator is installed and we're good to go.